I paid for my mother-in-law's 60th birthday party only for her to tell me last minute that only family was invited and I wasn't part. So I canceled every payment I made and walked away. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout-out in our next story. Today's special shout-out goes to Sandra from Los Angeles. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. Mark stood in the middle of the banquet hall, his phone pressed to his ear, sweat beading on his forehead. The caterer's voice crackled through the line, sharp and impatient. So, Mr. Mark, you're sure about the extra dessert table? It's gonna cost more, you know. Mark nodded, even though the caterer couldn't see him. Yeah, add it. Make it fancy. My mother-in-law loves sweets. Let's make this party perfect. He hung up and shoved the phone into his pocket, wiping his hands on his jeans. The hall smelled like fresh paint and polished wood, and the chandeliers above glittered like stars. Tables were already set up, draped in white cloths, with gold centerpieces waiting to be filled with flowers. This was it. Eleanor's 60th birthday party. Mark had spent weeks planning it, pouring his hard-earned money into every detail. The venue, the food, the live band. He'd even hired a photographer to capture the big moments. It wasn't cheap, but Mark didn't care. Eleanor was Lydia's mom, and Lydia was his wife. 10 years of marriage, and Mark still felt like he had to prove himself to her family. This party? It was his chance to show them he belonged. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Lydia. Mom's so excited. Thanks for doing this, babe. Love you. Mark smiled, his chest warming. Lydia's words always did that to him, made him feel like he was doing something right. He texted back, anything for you. See you tonight. He walked out of the hall, the cool evening air hitting his face. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange and pink. Mark climbed into his car, the leather seats creaking under his weight. He turned on the radio, humming along to an old song as he drove home. In his mind, he pictured the party, Eleanor laughing, Lydia beaming, the whole family clapping him on the back, saying, Mark, you did good. But dreams have a way of cracking, don't they? 3 days before the party, Mark drove to Eleanor's house to confirm the guest list. The house was big, with a wide porch and a garden full of roses. Eleanor loved her roses, always bragging about them, like they were her babies. Mark parked his car and rang the doorbell, his clipboard tucked under his arm. Eleanor opened the door, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a blue dress, the kind that screamed, I'm in charge. Her eyes flicked over Mark, quick and sharp, like she was sizing him up. Oh, Mark. Come in, she said, her voice flat. Inside, the living room smelled like lavender and old books. Lydia was there, sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. She smiled at Mark, but it was a tight, nervous smile, like she knew something he didn't. Mark sat down, flipping open his clipboard. All right, Eleanor, I've got the final guest list here. Just need to double-check. We're at 75 people, right? Eleanor leaned back in her armchair, crossing her arms. Actually, I've made some changes, she said, her tone casual, like she was talking about the weather. I decided to keep it family only. You know, just the close ones. Mark frowned, his pen hovering over the paper. Family only? But we invited your cousins, your friends from church. Those aren't family, Eleanor cut in, her voice sharp now. I wanted intimate. Just us. Mark nodded slowly, trying to process. Okay, that's fine. I'll call the caterer, adjust the numbers. But I'll need the new list. Eleanor waved a hand, like she was swatting a fly. Oh, don't worry. I've already handled it. Just family, like I said. Mark glanced at Lydia, waiting for her to jump in, to say something. But she just stared at her hands, her lips pressed tight. A cold feeling started to creep up Mark's spine. All right, he said, forcing a smile. Family only. Got it. So, I'll still be there, right? To help set up, make sure everything's smooth. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, just for a second, but Mark caught it. She leaned forward, her voice low and cold. Mark, when I say family only, I mean family. You're not on the list. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. What? He said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor shrugged, like it was no big deal. You and Lydia don't have kids yet. In my eyes, that doesn't make you family. Not really. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, loud and fast, like a drum. He turned to Lydia, his eyes pleading. Lydia, say something. Tell her she's wrong. But Lydia didn't look at him. She stared at the floor, her fingers twisting together. Mom's just traditional, she mumbled. It's not personal, Mark. Not personal? Mark's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. Not personal? He'd spent thousands of dollars, weeks of his life, planning this party. He'd stayed up late, double-checking every detail, just to make Eleanor happy. And now he wasn't family? He stood up, his clipboard falling to the floor with a loud clatter. Fine, he said, his voice shaking. If I'm not family, then I'm not paying for this. I'm done. Eleanor's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open. What? You can't just... I can. Mark snapped, cutting her off. I'll cancel everything. The venue, the caterer, the band, all of it. If I'm not family, I'm not responsible. Lydia jumped to her feet, her face pale. Mark, stop. You're overreacting. This is Mom's birthday. Overreacting? Mark laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. You let her sit there and tell me I'm not family and I'm overreacting? No, Lydia. I'm done. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The cool night air hit his face, but it didn't cool the fire burning in his chest. He climbed into his car, his hand shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. His phone buzzed, Lydia, calling, but he ignored it. By the time he got home, the news had spread. His phone lit up with messages from Lydia's cousins, her aunts, all calling him wicked, selfish, petty. Social media posts popped up, accusing him of ruining Eleanor's big day. Mark scrolled through them, his jaw tight, his heart pounding. He tossed his phone onto the couch and walked to his study, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. On his desk was a photo from his wedding day, him and Lydia, smiling, happy. He stared at it, his chest aching. Had he ever really been part of her family? Or had he always been an outsider, trying to fit in where he didn't belong? Mark sat down, his hands clenched on the desk. He wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. He'd protect himself, no matter what it took. But as he stared at that photo, a small voice in his head whispered, what if I'm wrong? And that question, quiet as it was, kept him awake all night. Mark sat on the couch, his phone buzzing like an angry wasp on the coffee table. Lydia's name flashed on the screen, over and over, but he didn't pick up. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows on the walls. His head throbbed, a dull ache that hadn't left since he stormed out of Eleanor's house. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clenched tight. He could still hear Eleanor's voice, cold and sharp, like a knife slicing through him. You're not family, Mark. Not really. And Lydia, who was supposed to have his back, just sat there, saying nothing. His phone buzzed again. Another text. He grabbed it, his thumb hovering over the screen. Mark, we need to talk. You can't just cancel everything. Mom's devastated. Devastated? Mark laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. Devastated? What about him? What about the weeks he'd spent planning, the money he'd poured into that party, the nights he'd stayed up late, double-checking every detail? He tossed the phone back onto the table, harder than he meant to. It skidded across the wood, landing with a thud. He stood up, pacing the room, his footsteps loud against the hardwood floor. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit here, letting them twist the story, letting them call him wicked. No, he wasn't going to let them win. The front door creaked open, and Lydia stepped inside, her purse slung over her shoulder. She looked tired, her eyes red and puffy, like she'd been crying. Mark stopped pacing, his hands on his hips, his jaw tight. Mark, she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. We need to talk. Talk? Mark's voice was sharp, louder than he meant it to be. Now you want to talk? Where was that energy when your mom told me I'm not family? Lydia flinched, but she didn't back down. She dropped her purse on the couch and crossed her arms. You're blowing this out of proportion. It was just a party. Mom's traditional. She didn't mean it like that. Didn't mean it? Mark stepped closer, his voice rising. She looked me in the eye and said, I'm not family, Lydia. And you sat there, saying nothing. You let her do that to me. Lydia's eyes flashed, her own anger bubbling up. She's my mom, Mark. What was I supposed to do? Start a fight right there. You're acting like a child, canceling everything like that. You embarrassed her in front of the whole family. Embarrassed her? Mark laughed again, the sound sharp and ugly. I embarrassed her? She humiliated me, Lydia. And you just let it happen. You think I'm going to pay for her party after that? No, I'm done. Lydia's face hardened, her lips pressed tight. She stepped closer, her voice low and cold. If you're done, then maybe we're done. Maybe we should just get a divorce. The words hit Mark like a slap. He blinked, his breath catching in his chest. Divorce? He stared at her, waiting for her to take it back, to say she didn't mean it. But Lydia just stood there, her eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable. You're serious? Mark said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Lydia nodded, her jaw tight. If you're going to act like this, then yes. I'm serious. But if you think I'm going to let you walk away and leave me with nothing, you're wrong. Fix this, Mark. Pay for the party, or we're done. Mark stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd expected her to fight, to argue. But this was different. This was a threat, a line drawn in the sand. And for the first time, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, desperation. She thought she could scare him, make him cave. But Mark wasn't going to cave. Not this time. Fine, he said, his voice steady now, cold as ice. If you want a divorce, go ahead. File the papers. But don't expect me to fix this. I'm done. Lydia's eyes widened, her mouth opening, then closing. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought he'd back down, thought he'd beg her to stay. But Mark just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his face hard. You're bluffing, she said, her voice shaking now. You wouldn't do that. Try me, Mark said, and he turned away, walking to the kitchen. He heard her footsteps behind him, quick and angry, but he didn't look back. The next morning, Mark drove to his mother's house, the sun barely up, the sky still gray. Grace lived in a small, cozy house on the edge of town, with a porch full of potted plants and a swing that creaked in the wind. Mark parked his car and rang the bell, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Grace opened the door, her hair tied back, her apron dusted with flour. She took one look at Mark's face and frowned. What's wrong, son? Mark stepped inside, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched on the wood. Lydia wants a divorce, he said, his voice flat. Grace's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Start from the beginning, she said, her voice calm but firm. Mark told her everything. Eleanor's words, Lydia's silence, the canceled party, the threats. Grace listened, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp, like she was piecing it all together. When Mark finished, she leaned back, her lips pressed tight. She's trying to scare you, Grace said, her voice low. She thinks you'll cave. But Mark, if she's serious about divorce, you need to protect yourself. She could come after everything. Your house, your savings, everything you've worked for. Mark nodded, his jaw tight. I know. That's why I'm here. I need your help. Grace raised an eyebrow, but she didn't ask questions. She knew Mark, knew how stubborn he could be when he felt cornered. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to transfer everything to you, Mark said, his voice steady now. The house, the investments, all of it. If she wants a divorce, fine. But she's not getting anything from me. Grace stared at him, her eyes searching his face. That's a big move, son, she said, her voice quiet. It's legal, but it's messy. And it's permanent. You sure you want to do this? Mark nodded, his hands clenched on the table. I'm sure. I'm not letting them take everything from me. Not after this. Grace sighed, but she didn't argue. She stood up, walking to the counter to grab her phone. All right, she said. I'll call my lawyer. But Mark, listen to me. Revenge feels good now, but it doesn't heal. You need to think about what you want, not just what you're angry about. Mark nodded, but her words felt distant, like they were coming from another room. He wasn't thinking about healing. He was thinking about protecting himself, about drawing a line in the sand. By the end of the day, the papers were signed. The house, the investments, everything. It was all in Grace's name now. Mark drove home, the weight of it settling in his chest. He felt lighter, but also heavier, like he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. That night, Lydia came home, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "I just got a call from the bank." "What did you do?" Mark stood up, his hands in his pockets, his face hard. "I protected myself," he said. "You wanted a divorce? Fine. But you're not getting anything from me." Lydia stared at him, her mouth open, her eyes filling with tears. "You're unbelievable," she whispered. "You're wicked, Mark." Just like Mom said. Mark didn't flinch. He just stared at her, his voice cold. "Maybe I am. But you made your choice, Lydia. Now live with it." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and Mark stood there, alone in the dark. Grace's words echoed in his head, quiet but persistent. "Revenge feels good now, but it doesn't heal." And for the first time, Mark wondered if he'd gone too far. Mark sat in the lawyer's office, the leather chair creaking under his weight. The room smelled like old paper and stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too harsh. His lawyer, Mr. Daniels, sat across from him, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, his hands folded on the desk. "So, Mark," Mr. Daniels said, his voice calm but firm. "Lydia's filed for divorce. It's official. Papers came in this morning." Mark nodded, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in his lap. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it out loud felt different, like a door slamming shut. "All right," he said, his voice flat. "What's next?" Mr. Daniels leaned back, his chair squeaking. "Well, she's asking for half of everything: house, savings, investments. But since you transferred your assets to your mother, there's not much in your name. Legally, you're in the clear. But Mark, I have to warn you, she's not happy." Her lawyer's digging, looking for loopholes. This could get messy. Mark stared at the desk, his eyes tracing the wood grain. Messy. That's what Grace had said, too. He could still hear her voice, low and steady, warning him about the consequences. But he wasn't backing down. "Not now. Let them dig," he said, his voice cold. "They won't find anything." Mr. Daniels nodded, but his eyes were sharp, like he could see through Mark's bravado. "All right," he said. "Just be ready. She's coming for you, Mark. And from what I've heard, her family's backing her up." Mark stood up, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Let them try," he said, and he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, the air was cold, the sky gray and heavy with clouds. Mark climbed into his car, his breath fogging in the chill. He turned on the heat, but it didn't touch the cold inside him, the ache that had settled in his chest. He drove home, the radio off, the silence pressing against him like a weight. When he got to the house, Lydia was there, waiting on the porch. She stood up as he parked, her arms crossed, her face pale. Mark climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes locked on hers. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to talk." "Talk?" Mark stopped, his hands on his hips. "You filed for divorce, Lydia. What's there to talk about?" Lydia stepped closer, her eyes flashing. "You think you can just transfer everything to your mom and leave me with nothing? You think that's fair?" "Fair." Mark laughed, but it was a sharp, bitter sound. "You want to talk about fair? You let your mom tell me I'm not family, and now you're mad because I protected myself? No, Lydia. You made your choice. Live with it." Lydia's face twisted, her eyes filling with tears. "You're wicked, Mark. Just like Mom said. You're selfish, manipulative." "Stop," Mark snapped, his voice loud, cutting her off. "Don't call me wicked. Don't stand there and act like I'm the bad guy. You wanted this. You threatened me. Now deal with it." Lydia stared at him, her mouth open, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then she turned and stormed off, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Mark watched her go, his chest tight, his hands clenched at his sides. That night, Mark drove to Grace's house, the headlights cutting through the dark. The porch light was on, warm and yellow, and Grace opened the door before he could knock. She took one look at his face and frowned. "Come in, son," she said, her voice soft. Inside, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Grace poured him a mug, sliding it across the table. Mark wrapped his hands around it, the warmth seeping into his palms, but it didn't touch the cold inside him. "She filed for divorce," he said, his voice flat. "Her lawyer's digging. She's coming for everything." Grace nodded, her eyes sharp, like she was piecing it together. I told you it'd get messy, she said, her voice calm but firm. But Mark, listen to me. Revenge feels good now, but it doesn't heal. You need to think about what you want, not just what you're angry about. Mark stared at the mug, his fingers tightening around it. I want to protect myself, he said, his voice low. I'm not letting them take everything from me. Grace sighed, leaning back in her chair. I get it, son. I do. But you need to ask yourself, did you do this to protect yourself? Or did you do it to hurt her? Mark looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He wanted to say it was to protect himself, but Grace's words cut deep, like a knife slicing through his defenses. He thought about Lydia's face, pale and angry, her voice shaking as she called him wicked. He thought about Eleanor, her cold eyes, her sharp words. And he thought about himself, pacing the dark living room, transferring everything to Grace in a fit of anger. I don't know, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Maybe both. Grace nodded, her lips pressed tight. That's honest, she said. But Mark, honest isn't enough. You need to decide what kind of man you want to be. Because right now, you're letting anger drive you. And anger, it burns everything, son. Even you. Mark stared at her, his chest aching. He wanted to argue, to say she was wrong, but her words stuck, like thorns in his mind. He stood up, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I need to think, he said, and he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in her childhood bedroom at Eleanor's house, the walls covered in old posters, the air thick with the smell of lavender. She stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over Mark's name, but she didn't call. Eleanor walked in, her silver hair pulled back, her blue dress crisp and sharp. You did the right thing, filing for divorce, she said, her voice firm. Mark's shown his true colors. He's wicked, Lydia. Always has been. Lydia nodded, but her chest felt tight, like she couldn't breathe. She thought about Mark's face, hard and cold, but also the times he'd been there for her. The late nights when he'd stayed up, helping her with work, the mornings when he'd made her coffee, just the way she liked it. Mom, Lydia said, her voice quiet. Do you think I pushed him too far? Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight. Don't you dare blame yourself, she said, her voice sharp. He's the one who canceled my party. He's the one who transferred everything. He's the problem, Lydia. Not you. Lydia nodded, but her mom's words felt heavy, like stones piling up on her chest. She thought about the family gathering last week, when her cousin had pulled her aside, her voice low. You know, Lydia, your mom's always been like this. She pushed my dad out too. She's good at making people feel small. Lydia hadn't wanted to hear it then, but now, sitting here, her mom's voice echoing in her ears, she couldn't shake it. She thought about Mark, about the party, about the way he'd looked at her, hurt and angry. And for the first time, she wondered if her mom was wrong. The next day, Mark walked into the lawyer's office for another meeting. Lydia was there, sitting in the waiting room, her hands folded in her lap. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lydia looked away, her jaw tight, and Mark turned to Mr. Daniels, his voice flat. Let's get this over with. But as he walked past her, he felt a pang in his chest, sharp and sudden. He thought about Grace's words, about Lydia's silence, about the life they'd built together. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Lydia sat on the edge of her childhood bed, the mattress creaking under her weight. The room smelled like lavender, sharp and heavy, the same scent that always clung to Eleanor's clothes. Posters from her teenage years still hung on the walls, faded bands and movie stars, staring down at her like ghosts. Her phone lay on the bed, screen dark, but Mark's name echoed in her mind. She wanted to call him, to say something, anything, but her fingers wouldn't move. Downstairs, Eleanor's voice carried through the house, sharp and loud, talking on the phone. He's wicked, I tell you. Always has been. Lydia's better off without him. Lydia's chest tightened, her hands clenching the edge of the bed. She'd heard those words before, over and over, but now they felt different, like a weight pressing down on her, heavier with every breath. She stood up, pacing the room, her footsteps muffled on the carpet. She thought about Mark's face, hard and cold, the way he'd looked at her in the lawyer's office. But she also thought about the quieter moments, the mornings when he'd made her coffee, the nights when he'd stayed up, helping her with work, his voice soft and steady. She thought about the party, about Eleanor's words, about her own silence. And for the first time, She wondered if she'd been wrong. Lydia stopped pacing, her eyes falling on a photo on the dresser. Her and Mark, smiling at a beach, the sun setting behind them. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the frame. Her cousin's words echoed in her mind, low and sharp. Your mom's always been like this, Lydia. She pushed my dad out, too. She's good at making people feel small. Lydia's chest ached, a sharp, sudden pain. She set the photo down, her hands shaking. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend her mom was right, not when it felt so wrong. She needed answers. She needed to know. She walked downstairs, her footsteps loud on the wooden steps. Eleanor was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked up as Lydia entered, her eyes narrowing. I'll call you back, she said, and she hung up, setting the phone on the coffee table. Lydia, Eleanor said, her voice firm. You look upset. What's wrong? Lydia stopped, her hands clenched at her sides. We need to talk, Mom, she said, her voice shaking. About Mark. About the party. About everything. Eleanor leaned back, crossing her arms. What's there to talk about? He showed his true colors. He canceled my party, transferred everything to his mother. He's wicked, Lydia. You're better off without him. Lydia's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing. Stop calling him wicked, she said, her voice louder now. Stop acting like he's the only one who did something wrong. You told him he's not family, Mom. She wanted to say more, to scream, to cry, but she didn't. She turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The cool night air hit her face, sharp and cold, but it didn't touch the fire inside her, the anger, the guilt, the pain. She climbed into her car, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She didn't know where to go, but she couldn't stay here, not with Eleanor, not with her words echoing in her ears. She drove, the headlights cutting through the dark, her mind racing. She thought about Mark, about the party, about her silence. And for the first time, she saw it clearly she'd been wrong. She'd let her mom control her, let her twist the story, and now she'd lost everything. Meanwhile, Mark sat in Grace's kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Grace sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, her eyes sharp. You've been quiet, son, she said, her voice soft. What's on your mind? Mark stared at the mug, his fingers tightening around it. I keep thinking about Lydia, he said, his voice low. About the party, about the asset transfer. You said revenge doesn't heal, Mom. And I think you're right. I did it to hurt her, to protect myself, but now I don't know. Grace nodded, her lips pressed tight. That's honest, she said. But Mark, honest isn't enough. You need to decide what kind of man you want to be. Because right now, you're letting anger drive you. And anger, it burns everything, son. Even you. Mark looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He thought about Lydia's face, pale and angry, her voice shaking as she called him wicked. He thought about Eleanor, her cold eyes, her sharp words. And he thought about himself, pacing the dark living room, transferring everything to Grace in a fit of anger. I need to fix this, he said, his voice quiet. I need to make it right. Grace smiled, a small, sad smile. That's a start, she said. But Mark, fixing it means facing it. Facing her. Facing yourself. Are you ready for that? Mark stared at her, his chest aching. He wanted to say yes, but the words stuck in his throat. He stood up, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I need to think, he said, and he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. That night, Lydia sat in a cheap motel room, the walls thin, the air thick with the smell of bleach. She stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over Mark's name. She wanted to call him, to say she was sorry, to say she'd been wrong. But her hands shook, her chest tight with fear. What if he didn't answer? What if he didn't care? She set the phone down, her eyes filling with tears. She thought about the photo on the dresser, the beach, the sunset, the smiles. She thought about her mom's words, sharp and cold, and her own silence, heavy and wrong. And for the first time, she knew what she had to do. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling, and typed a message. Mark, I'm sorry. Can we talk? She hit send, her heart pounding in her chest, and she waited, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Mark sat on the couch, the living room dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. His phone lay on the coffee table, screen dark, But Lydia's message glowed in his mind like a neon sign. Mark, I'm sorry. Can we talk? He'd read it 100 times, his thumb hovering over the reply button, but he hadn't typed anything. Not yet. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clenched tight. He thought about Grace's words, low and steady, echoing in his head. Fixing it means facing it. Facing her. Facing yourself. Are you ready for that? He wanted to be ready, but his chest ached, a sharp, sudden pain that wouldn't go away. He stood up, pacing the room, his footsteps loud against the hardwood floor. He thought about Lydia's face, pale and angry, her voice shaking as she called him wicked. But he also thought about the quieter moments, the mornings when he'd made her coffee, the nights when he'd stayed up, helping her with work, his voice soft and steady. He thought about the party, about Eleanor's words, about his own silence. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd been wrong, too. His phone buzzed, sharp and sudden, cutting through the silence. He grabbed it, his heart pounding in his chest. Another message from Lydia. Please, Mark. I need to see you. Just talk to me. Mark stared at the screen, his fingers trembling. He wanted to ignore it, to toss the phone away, to let the anger win. But Grace's words stuck, like thorns in his mind. He typed a reply, slow and deliberate. All right. Tomorrow. Coffee shop on 5th, 2 p.m. He hit send, his chest tight, and he set the phone down, the silence pressing against him like a weight. The next day, Mark walked into the coffee shop, the bell above the door jingling. The air smelled like roasted beans and fresh pastries, warm and inviting. Lydia was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide, her face pale. Mark sat down, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his jaw tight. You wanted to talk, he said, his voice flat. So talk. Lydia swallowed, her fingers tightening around the mug. Mark, I'm sorry, she said, her voice shaking. I messed up. I should have defended you. I let my mom control me, and I hurt you. I know that. Mark stared at her, his chest aching. He wanted to believe her, but the hurt was still there, sharp and raw. You let her tell me I'm not family, Lydia, he said, his voice low. You stood there, saying nothing. And then you threatened me, tried to scare me into fixing it. You think sorry fixes that? Lydia's eyes filled with tears, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I know it doesn't, she said. I know I hurt you. But Mark, I see it now. I see what my mom did, what I did. I confronted her. I told her I'm done letting her control me. I walked away, Mark. I'm staying in a motel because I couldn't stay with her. Not after this. Mark's eyes widened, his hands unclenching. You walked away, he said, his voice quieter now. From Eleanor? Lydia nodded, her tears spilling over. She told me to get out, she said, her voice breaking. She said I owe her, but I don't. I owe you. I owe you for the years you've been there, for the love you've given me. And I threw it away. I'm so sorry, Mark. Mark stared at her, his chest tight, his mind racing. He thought about Grace's words, about fixing it, about facing it. He thought about the asset transfer, about the anger that had driven him, about the cold, hard look on Lydia's face when she'd called him wicked. But now, sitting here, seeing her tears, hearing her voice, he felt something shift, something soften. I messed up too, he said, his voice low. I transferred everything to my mom. I did it to hurt you, to protect myself, but it was wrong. I've reversed it, Lydia. It's back in my name now. I'm trying to fix it too. Lydia's eyes widened, her mouth opening, then closing. You reversed it, she said, her voice quiet. You didn't have to do that. I did, Mark said, his voice steady now. Because Grace was right. Revenge doesn't heal. And I don't want to be that man, Lydia. The one who burns everything down just because he's angry. But I need to know, can we fix this? Can we trust each other again? Lydia stared at him, her tears spilling over, her hands trembling. I want to try, she said, her voice breaking. I want to fix it, Mark. I want to be better for you, for us. But I need time. And I need you to need time too. Mark nodded, his chest aching. I need time, he said, his voice quiet. But I'm willing to try. Not to save us, not yet. but to see if we can rebuild, if we can trust again. Lydia nodded, her lips trembling. Counseling, she said, her voice soft. We could start there. Not to fix everything, but to start. To talk. To listen. Mark stared at her, his mind racing. He thought about Grace's words, about fixing it, about facing it. He thought about the years they'd shared, the love, the pain, the mistakes. And for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but there. All right, he said, his voice steady now. Counseling. Let's start there. Lydia smiled, a small, sad smile, her tears spilling over. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. Thank you for giving us a chance. Mark nodded, his chest tight. They sat there, the silence heavy but different now, softer, warmer. The bell above the door jingled as someone walked in, and the sound snapped them out of it. Mark stood up, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I'll call you, he said, his voice quiet. We'll set it up. Lydia nodded, her eyes locked on his. Okay, she said, her voice soft. I'll be there. Mark turned and walked out, the cool air hitting his face, sharp and cold. He climbed into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He felt lighter, but also heavier, like he'd taken a step forward but didn't know where it would lead. He drove home, the headlights cutting through the dark, Grace's words echoing in his head. Fixing it means facing it. Facing her. Facing yourself. He wanted to believe they could fix it, but the doubt was still there, sharp and raw. That night, Lydia sat in the motel room, the walls thin, the air thick with the smell of bleach. She stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She typed a message, slow and deliberate. I've scheduled our first session. Next week. I'll send you the details. She hit send, her heart pounding in her chest, and she waited, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Mark's phone buzzed, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet. He grabbed it, his eyes scanning the message. He stared at it, his chest tight, his mind racing. He wanted to believe they could fix it, but the doubt was still there, sharp and raw. And for the first time, he wondered if they'd ever be whole again. Mark sat in the counselor's office, the chair soft but creaky, the air thick with the smell of lavender and old books. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a clock ticked on the wall, loud and steady, like a heartbeat. Lydia sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes flicking between him and the counselor, Dr. Harris, a woman with gray hair and sharp, kind eyes. So, Mark, Dr. Harris said, her voice calm but firm. Last week, you talked about feeling like an outsider in Lydia's family. How are you feeling today? Mark shifted in his seat, his hands clenching the armrests. He thought about the party, about Eleanor's cold words, about Lydia's silence. He thought about the asset transfer, about the anger that had driven him, about the doubt that lingered, sharp and raw. I still feel it, he said, his voice low. Like I don't belong. Like I never did. But I'm trying to let it go. Trying to focus on us, not them. Dr. Harris nodded, her eyes sharp but warm. That's progress, she said. And Lydia, you talked about your struggle with your mother's influence. How's that going? Lydia swallowed, her fingers twisting together. It's hard, she said, her voice quiet. I've set boundaries with her. Limited contact. But it hurts, you know? She's my mom. But I know I need to do this. For me. For us. Mark looked at her, his chest aching. He saw the pain in her eyes, the guilt, the determination. He wanted to believe they could fix it, but the doubt was still there, small and sharp, like a splinter under his skin. Dr. Harris leaned forward, her hands folded on her desk. You're both doing the work, she said. That's important. But remember, healing isn't linear. There'll be setbacks. There'll be doubts. The question is, are you willing to face them together? Mark and Lydia looked at each other, their eyes locking. For a moment, the room was quiet, the clock ticking loud and steady. Then Lydia nodded, her lips trembling. I am, she said, her voice breaking. I want to try. Mark nodded, his chest tight. Me too, he said, his voice quiet. I want to try. The session ended, and they walked out together, the cool air hitting their faces, sharp and fresh. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange and pink. They stood on the sidewalk, the silence heavy but different now, softer, warmer. Hey, Lydia said, her voice soft. Remember that diner we used to go to? The one with the terrible coffee. Mark smiled, a small, sad smile. Yeah, he said. The one where the waiter always forgot your order. Lydia laughed, a small, quiet sound. Yeah. Want to go? Just for old time's sake. Mark stared at her, his mind racing. He thought about Grace's words, about fixing it, about facing it. He thought about the years they'd shared, the love, the pain, the mistakes. And for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but there. All right, he said, his voice steady now. Let's go. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat in her living room, the air thick with the smell of lavender, the silence heavy. She stared at her phone, her fingers hovering over Lydia's name, but she didn't call. She thought about the confrontation, about Lydia's words, sharp and raw. I'm done letting you control me. She thought about the family gathering last week, the way her sister had looked at her, her voice low. You've always been like this, Eleanor. You push people away. Eleanor's chest ached, a sharp, sudden pain. She wanted to call Lydia, to say she was sorry, to say she'd been wrong. But her hands shook, her pride sharp and stubborn. She set the phone down, her eyes filling with tears. She thought about the party, about Mark's face, about Lydia's silence. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd lost her daughter for good. That night, Mark sat in Grace's kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Grace sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, her eyes sharp. You look different, son, she said, her voice soft. Lighter. What's changed? Mark stared at the mug, his fingers tightening around it. We went to counseling, he said, his voice low. Talked about everything. The party, the asset transfer. Eleanor. It's hard, Mom. But I think we're trying. Really trying. Grace nodded, her lips pressed tight. That's good, she said. But Mark, remember what I said. Healing isn't linear. There'll be setbacks. There'll be doubts. The question is, are you willing to face them? Mark looked up, his eyes meeting hers. I am, he said, his voice steady now. I want to be better. For me. For us. Grace smiled, a small, warm smile. That's my boy, she said, her voice soft. But Mark, don't forget yourself in this. You need to heal too. Not just for her, but for you. Mark nodded, his chest tight. He thought about the diner, about Lydia's laugh, about the years they'd shared. He thought about the camera he'd bought last week, the photography classes he'd signed up for, the way it felt to focus on something new, something his. And for the first time, he felt a spark of joy, small and bright, like a light in the dark. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in a small cafe, the air warm with the smell of fresh pastries. She stared at her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She was writing, journaling, pouring out her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. She thought about the diner, about Mark's smile, about the years they'd shared. She thought about Eleanor, about the boundaries she'd set, about the pain of walking away. And for the first time, she felt a sense of freedom, small and fragile, but there. She closed her laptop, her eyes filling with tears. She thought about the counseling sessions, about the work they were doing, about the doubts that lingered, sharp and raw. She thought about Mark, about the man he was, about the man she wanted to be. And for the first time, she knew what she wanted, not just for them, but for herself. That evening, Mark and Lydia met outside the diner, the neon sign buzzing overhead, the air cool and crisp. They stood there, the silence heavy but different now, softer, warmer. Hey, Lydia said, her voice soft. Thanks for coming. Mark nodded, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Yeah, he said, his voice quiet. Thanks for asking. They walked inside, the bell above the door jingling, the air warm with the smell of grease and coffee. They sat down, the waiter forgetting Lydia's order, just like old times. They laughed, a small, quiet sound, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They knew it, felt it, carried it like a weight. They talked, slow and careful, about the counseling, about the work, about the doubts. They talked about the future, about what they wanted, about what they feared. And for the first time, they listened, really listened, to each other. The night ended, and they walked out together, the cool air hitting their faces, sharp and fresh. They stood on the sidewalk, the silence heavy but different now, softer, warmer. I'll see you next week, Lydia said, her voice soft. Counseling. And maybe coffee after. Mark smiled, a small, sad smile. Yeah, he said, his voice steady now. Coffee sounds good. They parted ways, the headlights cutting through the dark, the silence pressing against them like a weight. Mark drove home, Grace's words echoing in his head. Don't forget yourself in this. You need to heal too. He thought about the camera, about the classes, about the spark of joy. And for the first time, he felt at peace, small and fragile, but there. Lydia drove to the motel, her eyes filling with tears. She thought about the diner, about Mark's smile, about the years they'd shared. She thought about Eleanor, about the boundaries she'd set, about the freedom she'd found. And for the first time, she knew she'd be okay, with or without him. But she hoped, with every breath, she hoped it would be with him. The story ends here, on a quiet, hopeful note, with Mark and Lydia walking forward, together but apart, healing but uncertain. The listener is left to wonder, will they rebuild? Will they part ways? Will they find peace? And in that silence, the question lingers, sharp and bright, like a light in the dark. Thanks for listening to this story. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more audio stories. Share your thoughts. What do you think happens next? We'd love to hear from you. See you soon in our next story.